Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Greta Hagen, he, she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Development and External Relations at JDI, Jane Doe Inc. And I am thrilled all the time, but especially today, to be working with Maria Williams Howard from Framework Solutions, who many of you have met and talked with, and I think consider a friend now, as I do. But she's here today to share kind of everything about continuums of care and how they came to be, some of the statutes that define them, some of the processes, and then we're going to talk a little bit about kind of center that here in Massachusetts. We're going to talk to Pat Kelleher from Family Community Resources and Stephanie Brown from Casa Mirna to get some kind of more local perspectives, and then we'll have time to chat. Definitely, if you have questions, I see just scanning the list, some of you are COC experts also, and so might kind of call you in, and some of you, Claire, not to put you on the spot, but Claire and I have joked that it's COC curious is also a way to define some of us. So I think there will be something here for everybody. So really glad you're here. And I am going to turn it over to Maria. And Maria, if you want to just give yourself a little intro too, and we'll go from there. And I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, so please feel free to drop questions in the chat. I think unless they are um, unless it's impossible for us to move on without answering like a clarifying question, I think we'll just save them till the end. But I will jump in if somebody's like, wait a minute, I cannot go on unless you clarify. So I'll try to pipe in with that. But otherwise, I'll turn it over to you, Maria.
Thanks so much, Greta. I'm so happy to be here with you all this morning. My name is Maria Williams Howard, and I am the gender-based violence housing specialist with Framework Strategies. We are a consulting firm out of Philadelphia, but we work nationally and have a specialization within our firm that specializes in housing strategies around strategies for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And I have been working with JDI now for about a year, and it has been truly delightful. And I've met many of you, and I just so enjoy working with you all. It's been really lovely. One of the things that came from time that I spent with some of you in person last year was the need for some sort of, a friend of mine calls them table setting trainings. So everybody knows the same information in the same format and can proceed forward, knowing the same sort of like consistency around a topic. So today we're talking about HUD continuums of care. This is a really interesting time to be talking about HUD continuums of care, and we'll talk about why. But first, I would like a couple of my friends that have joined us today and your friends to introduce themselves. We have Stephanie Brown with us and Pat Keller Parker also, who are both going to be talking a little bit about their experiences with their local continuums of care. So if you both could introduce yourselves quickly, that would be fabulous. Thank you.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie Brown from Casa Mirna, and thrilled to have Maria lead this workshop, this curious workshop for us, table setting, and for Greta and Hema for putting it all together.
I'm, excuse me, Pat Kelleher from Family and Community Resources, and it has been just an exciting journey working with this group and talking about COCs, and we're all continuously learning about COCs. And I think this, I just want to put out there that our hope is that more JDI programs will apply for this funding. It's a lot of work, but it's so well worth it.
Thank you both so much. So we're going to go through some general information. And like Greta said, if you have questions that you're like, wait a minute, that is not a thing that even when you explained it, it still doesn't make sense, like please let's pause and we'll talk through it. Because I think that when a lot of folks come to work with those of us that have been in the gender-based violence movement forever, we use a lot of terminology that to us it's just second nature. And so we can have whole conversations that my colleagues in the housing movement have said it is like you're speaking another language. And it is true. And what I know is that the housing world has that same sort of vernacular that it can be like you're speaking another language. I like to think that I can be an interpreter between the two. I'm not always clear, though, on what folks know and don't know. So if there are things that come up that you don't understand, please let's pause and we can talk about them. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Sorry, I don't have my double screen today, so it's taking me just a second. I apologize. Okay, can everybody see that? Great. All right, so today we're going to talk about basically a brief continuum of care program history and background, and talk a little bit about how the continuum of care history has intersected with the domestic violence and sexual assault movement and housing movement within the domestic violence and sexual assault world, because we have always done housing work in our movement also. We're going to actually talk about specifically what is a continuum of care, the responsibilities of a continuum of care, which is really key for you all to know, because what we know is that a lot of continuums of care don't hold up their end of responsibilities. We're going to talk about continuum of care program funding uses, and those are the things that you can use continuum of care money for to actually keep people housed. And then we're going to hear from Pat and Stephanie and talk a little bit about how they got involved and engaged in their continuums of care, and find out what you can do on the local level to get involved with yours. And then we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So, since we're recording this training and it's going to be something that is available to you all moving forward, I wanted to make sure that you had some terms for reference. So, there are a lot of these words that folks in the housing world throw around, and these are a number of different acronyms that folks use. This is not a comprehensive list, and there are some things in here that you might not hear all of the time, but there may be things that your friends in the housing world would use often. There are a couple here that I want to point out that are going to be important to this conversation. When we say COC, we mean Continuum of Care. When we say HUD, we mean the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. When we say NOFO, we mean the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And when we say NOFO in this context, we mean the ones that HUD releases, not the ones that any other federal department releases, but the ones specific to HUD. And there's a lot of talk about a NOFO right now, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then the one thing I wanted to point out on here, because it's important to our conversation in some degree, is usage, and that's the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. That's actually an entity that doesn't exist anymore. It's a recent decision by this administration, but it has been an important entity that has been a cross-sector collaboration at the federal level, that has included representatives from many different federal agencies that have come together to develop often what has ended up being the president's plan to end homelessness during an administration that has really informed policy and legislation around housing and homelessness for years and years. Usage has done something called benchmark setting within the housing homeless world. And that has led to really what HUD has then incorporated as benchmarks for successful housing programs within communities. Those benchmarks haven't changed. And so it's still important, even though usage doesn't exist, to know where those benchmarks came from and why they exist, and where you can look back historically to learn more information and to gain more knowledge. So just wanted to provide that context for you. Okay, so here's some pretty abbreviated housing history. We're going to start in the 80s. And the reason that I like to start there is because that's also when the domestic violence movement, and I'm going to say domestic violence movement specifically here because um, and to clarify, I want to let you know that I have worked in the domestic violence, sexual assault movement my entire career, for about 20 years. I started in working in domestic violence, sexual assault shelter, working overnights in shelter, and have always worked at the intersection of housing and survivor need. Um, so I very much identify as part of the gender-based violence movement, of the DVSA movement. And so when I say our, I mean that's my context is I identify that as part of the movement that we are all in. So when I say our movement, I mean that our movement unfortunately didn't do a great job of including sexual assault survivors all along the road when we're talking about housing work. And we can see that at the federal level, at the local level, and pretty comprehensively all along. And unfortunately, that started in the 1980s in shelter. Domestic violence survivors were often included in emergency shelter options in the 1980s when those became formalized. There were lots of informal shelter options that were available to survivors that were surviving all sorts of violence. But what we saw is formal options available for domestic violence survivors. And in the mainstream housing homeless movement, what we saw then in the 80s also was the development of general emergency shelters. And they were really being seen as the key intervention to homelessness. What's interesting about this is that while these two interventions were running simultaneously, the domestic violence movement wasn't viewing the folks that they were serving in emergency shelter as homeless on the whole. They were viewing them as survivors that needed emergency solutions for safety, but not necessarily because their housing was unstable. And so that sort of differentiation was one of the first pieces of the puzzle that began to pull these two movements of housing homelessness solutions and the movement of gender-based violence apart. From there, it came to be pretty clear that folks weren't moving out of emergency shelter. There weren't resources for folks to move out quickly. So transitional housing became a thing that emerged. And transitional housing is an intervention that's been used widely in the domestic violence movement and has supported survivors moving on from emergency shelter in the same way that housing homeless movement has used it to support individuals and families moving on from emergency shelter. What's interesting here, I think, is that the gender-based violence movement really honed in on what transitional housing could be and really developed a lot of expertise in transitional housing. The vast majority of great research and quality research that proves that transitional housing works has come from the gender-based violence movement, and that still stands today. So basically, for the whole of a couple decades, these were the housing interventions that existed. There are other housing interventions like public housing, which I know is very prevalent in Massachusetts. And that's not talked about here because we're really talking about the interventions that are quick and non-permanent options that help folks get back on their feet in a relatively quick manner. So, what then we saw in the Obama administration is a real concentration on knowing that transitional housing was not enough to move people on from emergency shelter. Homelessness crisis was gaining every day, and there had to be solutions. And that's when the Hearth Act came into play, and the opening doors was the presidential solutions to end homelessness. Um, this is where the term housing first came from. And the housing first is the idea that housing is a tool to achieve stability and not something to be earned once stability was achieved. There was an unfortunate thing that was happening in transitional housing, that the idea is you had to become stable and then you could look for permanent housing. But what we know is that housing is a thing that creates stability and can really be the thing that can, help someone achieve safety and all of these other sort of components that folks were looking for to ensure that somebody could move on from transitional housing. And in the idea of housing first, it wasn't the idea that shelter shouldn't exist. It wasn't the idea that transitional housing shouldn't exist, but it was the idea that we needed to have more options that were going to allow people to actually be permanently housed and stay permanently housed in a more sustainable manner. One of the key things that we saw in the gender-based violence movement through the Hearth Act is the idea that survivors were recognized as homeless through the HUD homeless housing definition that's included in the Hearth Act, and we'll talk about that later. And then in the 2010s, through the Hearth Act and the funding of the continuum of care in the Hearth Act, we saw really the development of permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing as really the forefront of housing interventions that were coming from HUD. Rapid rehousing is really the thing that had been pushed out most significantly during this period of time. And what we saw is the housing first model was adapted for survivors and really proving the idea that survivors needed a whole variety of housing interventions to maintain safety, and that oftentimes those housing interventions were going to make the difference between them ever having to go back to shelter again or to an abusive home. And we also saw rapid rehousing being really integrated into survivor services in a way it hadn't been prior, all the way to in 2018, HUD releasing in the continuum of care notice of funding options a domestic violence bonus. And that's something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that many of us have talked about, that we don't know if it is happening again in the next HUD funding cycle, but what we do know is that it was available from 2018 until the last funding round and really allowed domestic violence, sexual assault organizations to apply for funds to directly serve survivors in a way that HUD had never prioritized prior, and truly like use those funds to make a difference, to really show that the permanent housing achieved by survivors is the thing that can equal safety in a way that hadn't been allowed to be shown prior, because historically domestic violence and sexual assault organizations had not had access to these funds. And we'll talk a little bit about why. So, as we talked about the Hearth Act, it revised the definition of homelessness. It took the emergency shelter program and turned it into the emergency solutions program. And the other terminology that's used for this grant is called ESG, or Emergency Solutions Grant, which is something that I know that some of you receive. So that's another program that also funds emergency shelter and homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. It is not what we're talking about today, though, so that's a separate program from the Continuum of Care. It consolidated different homeless assistance programs, and then it codified into law the Continuum of Care planning process. And then one of the most critical things it did was define the categories of homelessness. What this allowed is for the interventions that HUD was presenting, particularly for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, to say that these individuals that fall into these categories are eligible for these interventions, because what we saw is the need was far too great to meet the resources available, which is unfortunate and still true today, and part of the reason that we know that it's so critical that we ensure that gender-based violence organizations are getting involved and applying for these funds, because so many of the families that we serve are part of that critical need. Um, what's great is the folks that were involved in writing the Hearth Act understood that survivors were part of that need and included survivors in these categories of homelessness. And so when you hear people talk about category 4 homelessness, that's the category that survivors fall into. Um, there was a lot of course, there was a lot of drama about how this was going to play out and with the terminology that was going to be used. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with things at the federal level, there has to be a lot of give and take around what wording is going to be used and who's going to be included and what definitions. And what I know from the folks that helped draft this legislation is that it didn't include all of the words they wanted it to include. It was far more cumbersome than they wanted it to be. But we'll have the opportunity at a later training to talk more about the Category 4 definition, why it exists the way that it does, and how we can make sure that it's as expansive as it can be, and including as many folks that identify as survivors as it can. Using these categories to bring people into housing rather than screen them out of housing is the key thing to remember when you're looking at the categories of homelessness. I also want to clarify here that when folks in the homeless housing movement are talking about Category 4, they often just talk about fleeing or attempting to flee DV. They don't include sexual assault. And that is problematic and untrue. And so we want to make sure that we're talking about sexual assault survivors here. We also know that this applies to folks that are trying to be safe from dating violence and from stalking, and from human trafficking survivors that are also experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault. And so the definition is expansive, and it's important that those of us in the gender-based violence movement really understand it and know how to educate our partners in the homeless housing movement to make sure that they understand it fully, and that we can, again, bring as many survivors into these programs as we can. So let's get into the Continuum of Care program itself a little bit. The COC program is built along the idea that it takes more than just the funding for permanent housing to end homelessness. Um, the, the thing that I think is important for you all to remember about this is something that in the gender-based violence movement we have known all along. What HUD came to is that they understood that there was no way that someone's episode of homelessness was going to end if they were just going to put a roof over their heads. And so they came to the idea through a lot of great research and input and guidance from communities and really strategic partners into the Hearth Act and into the legislation that was included, that it was a community-wide effort that needed to be included to end homelessness for families and individuals within that community. So the continuum of care, when we talk about it, it's both the vision of the community ending homelessness, the commitment, and it's the funding that is the funding that that providers have access to, that addresses ending homelessness. And then it's how that funding is accessed and utilized by those individuals and families experiencing homelessness. So it's the vision, it's the funding, and it's the utilization of the funds. That's what makes up the continuum of care. So one of the things I think that we do incredibly well in the gender-based violence movement is know that someone's safety is not just achieved by them leaving an abusive partner, that someone's safety is achieved by them also engaging in whatever else that they may identify that they need to regain stability in their lives, and however they may define stability and reconnection with family and faith community and engaging in economic stability efforts and safe housing efforts and all of these other things that we know make up a survivor's life and make a more holistic picture of a life, because we know that when a survivor is experiencing abuse, that their life becomes far less holistic and smaller. And so we know that a survivor's life, as they get safer, becomes more expansive. What the Continuum of Care program does is look at how those folks experiencing homelessness can gain greater stability by a more expansive response. So that's the most like trauma-informed, thoughtful way I think that we can think of a continuum of care. It's the way that I would encourage you all to think about it in a continuum of care. I'm looking forward to hearing what Pat and Stephanie think about that definition of a continuum of care, because it doesn't necessarily meet the way that that plays out in communities, but it is the heart of it. It is the true, I think, thought and vision behind it. And I think it's important for those of us that really understand that sort of community effort behind ending um, a a problem that is a community is experiencing. And we deeply understand that in gender-based violence work, that we continue to remind the folks that operate our continuums of care that this is the greater vision. And I know that our partners love hearing from us about these sort of reminders. So HUD defines a continuum of care specifically. So this is like sort of a boiled down version of all those regulations, as the representatives of relevant organizations, and that's really important, and we'll come back to it, within a geographic area to carry out the responsibilities set forth, and we'll talk about those within the Continuum of Care Program Interim Rule. And when we talk about the Continuum of Care Program Interim Rule, what that basically is the regulations that codify the Continuum of Care program that folks that receive Continuum of Care funds have to follow. We'll talk a little bit about those too. Not too much because they're only interesting to folks like me. So if you ever want to know more about the continuum of care regulations, I'm happy to help walk you through those, but they're not relevant enough to like dig into in a real way. But there are some very specific things that we'll talk about just so you have general information around them. So when we think about a continuum of care in a broad base, we know that it covers a designated geography, but in all over the country, all of those geographic regions look different. And they're all designated locally in a way that locally makes the most sense. Um, I'm going to use the word sense pretty loosely, though, because a lot of it is politically driven. A lot of it is driven by the idea that, like, this county or this region or this city or what have you believes that it can have the solution to ending homelessness in a way that is more significant or important or defined than others. And so they want to be their own continuum of care. And in some ways, that can make a lot of sense. In other ways, it could be a whole lot more impactful if others could, you know, if some of those smaller continuums of care could join together. I work a lot across the state of Pennsylvania. We see a lot of individual counties that are their own continuums of care. We know that if those counties came together to, function as one larger continuum of care, they could have a lot more influence. They could have a lot more funding. And that is one thing that Massachusetts has done incredibly well. So let's look at the continuums of care in Massachusetts. This is a map from 2021, but it's still accurate. The colors here are representative of the continuums of care, which are listed here below the Continuum of Care 2021 heading. There are a number of continuums of care in Massachusetts that contain more than one county. In fact, the vast majority of them do. And many of the continuums of care in Massachusetts are called something different than what is listed here, which can be confusing. But to give you an example, let's see, the Berkshire, Franklin, Hampshire area that we see in green. The actual continuum of care name is Pittsfield, Northampton, Berkshire, Franklin, Hampshire counties. The number that it goes by, because every continuum of care across the country is given a number, and so that's MA-501. But you all refer to it, I believe, as the Tri-County Continuum of Care. Is that correct? Tri-County?
We do. Yes.
Great, thank you. As I started talking about it, I'm like, oh gosh, I hope I'm saying the right thing now because that'd be real embarrassing. There are other examples of that. I think, I can't remember now, of course, Pat, the continuum of care that Pat is in goes by a different name than the many counties listed off that start with Quincy, for example. So when you see these, know that if you want to know more about the specific continuum of care, doing a simple Google search for the number is going to give you more information. If you also want to know more about the continuum of care, I think that looking at the different JDI member programs within the continuum of care and finding out who is involved with the continuum of care, reaching out to member programs that you have connections with in the continuum of care, I think is by far the best way to know and understand more. If you want to find out how you know who could be funded within the continuum of care, also from JDI, please let me or Greta or Heyman know. We can definitely help you find out that information. Does anybody have any questions so far?
I don't see any yet, but folks can also pop in if they do. Or you
But
can go
I'll
forth.
also add
Yeah.
that if it's not making sense, it's okay because even when you've been doing this for a long time, it doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. So
So true.
Yeah, go forth, Maria. We'll do we'll do questions if they pop up.
Okay, sounds great. All right, so the participants of the COC, and remind you again, we're talking about a community-wide response. Are all of these types of organizations within the geographic region that we just showed you? So when you are looking at who should be represented within a continuum of care, this is an example of those sorts of organizations. What's important to remember here is that it is also these sorts of organizations that should have been brought together when the continuum of care was being developed to identify the needs of the continuum of care, how the governance of the continuum of care was going to operate, what committees were going to exist within the continuum of care, who needed to be prioritized for funding within the continuum of care, all these sorts of things. What we have found nationally, and so this is everywhere, is that victim service providers, and that's how HUD refers to us, is victim service providers, were not included. Now, some of this goes back to the idea that in the 1980s, when HUD was operating shelters and we were operating shelters, we did not view the folks that we were serving as homeless. And th and that's okay. It's not like that was some sort of critical mistake. But what it did was not link our movements from the beginning. It took a long time for the gender-based violence movement to understand that survivors, once they entered shelter, were actually literally considered homeless and then needed a safe housing solution to regain stability. Um, that has to do with a lot of things that we don't need to get into right now, but has really, I think, driven a wedge between the movements. I think that the bigger wedge that was driven, though, was really by the idea that HUD had many ideas about what needed to be required for individuals and families to receive assistance. And what was unfortunate about the vast majority of those requirements is that they were oftentimes very much at odds with anything that we would ever require from a survivor. So our movement has been always in the philosophically behind the idea that we would not require services of survivors, that we were not going to replicate things that abusive partners may have done. And we know that if survivors are required or mandated to do XYZ to be able to stay in shelter or to be able to gain permanent housing or whatever that may be, that those are just replicating behaviors, and that we are here to help survivors establish self-determination and to walk alongside them in their journey and to make sure they have the resources they need to establish safety on their terms. That is not how housing programs operate on the whole. There are some housing programs that do, and that's fantastic. But housing programs are far more based in, I need this information from you. And to be able to stay here, you need to give me this information. And we need to meet on these terms. And we need to make sure you do these things. And then after this amount of time, that's when this program ends. And so there's this real philosophical difference between the trauma-informed way that gender-based violence organizations are founded in and the operational way that housing organizations move through their work. And there are pluses and minuses to both. But that fundamental sort of difference and not understanding how the movements really deeply needed each other led to victim service providers not being at the table when the vast majority of continuums of care were being established after the Hearth Act passed. This then led to victim service providers not being prioritized for funding, and survivors then ultimately not receiving funding within the continuum of care. So much so that entire data systems were built around survivors' data not being able to even be entered into those data systems because it would have been a violation of VAWA, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And survivors not even being eligible for some of the programs that existed. And I could go on. But the real fundamental issue here is that we know that the vast majority of female-headed households that are waiting for a housing resource are also survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault. And so the vast majority of particularly female-headed households with children, so families that are waiting for resources, also are the people that we serve. So there has to be a way for the housing movement and the gender-based violence movement to work together moving forward because there is no way that we don't need each other. And I think that particularly now, as resources are becoming far more scarce, the inclination is to move even farther away. And I think that these are the moments where we have to figure out how we're going to come together. And so it's timely to be talking about this, but also I think can really um, cause a lot of anxiety, knowing that resources are short and knowing that there's a lot of unknown factors about resources are coming from. But what I can tell you is that when things are normal and the funding is moving through HUD in normal ways and the federal government is open, that this is an incredibly reliable and steady funding resource for housing for survivors. And the more that your organizations engage, the more they're connected to housing funding resources for survivors, but also the more they're connected to all these other organizations. And it gives you a platform to engage with these other organizations, aside from just the normal work of your organization. It also gives you a platform to engage with them through the lens of housing. And so I think that that is a really powerful modality and something that I would encourage you all to think about. So the continuum of care has a number of responsibilities. And the continuum of care minimum rule, and those are all those rules that, as a colleague of mine says, keeps people like me in a job, which I don't think is entirely true, but might be more true than I want to admit, is the regulatory implementation of the COC program, including the COC planning process. And the idea behind those rules is that the COC recipients, so the funding recipients and subrecipients, must follow the regulations in the COC program interim rule. But specifically, that impacts survivors in really unique and interesting ways. COC regulations include guidance for serving survivors and what it means for survivors to be eligible for specific resources. We talked about that within the Category 4 eligibility. We talked about that, you know, even in the regulations, survivors are named as victim server or survivor serving organizations are named as victim service providers. It says in the regulations that VSPs cannot enter data into HMIS because of VAWA housing protections. An important thing for you all to know and to remember is that HUD has adopted the Violence Against Women Act. And what that means is that with every renewal of the Violence Against Women Act and all of those housing protections, those are all adopted by HUD each time it's renewed. And so every time there are new additions made to VAWA and new and additional protections added, those then become integrated into HUD regulation. And it is not a seamless process, but it is true. And it is often directly at odds with other COC regulations that exist. And when you talk to folks about this, what I have found is that they will say, well, of course, Maria, because that's just what federal regulations do. They all contradict each other. And that, you know, and that's just what we have to learn to do is navigate around that when you receive different sources of federal funds and blah, blah, blah. But the difference here is that we're talking about survivors' lives. And so I want you all to be able to take this really seriously, and to be able to advocate for ensuring that VAWA protections are taken very seriously by your continuums of care. You're very fortunate in Massachusetts because between JDI and mass housing, you have incredible advocates that are really doing fabulous work in ensuring that VAWA protections are being talked about at the state level. What we know, though, is that oftentimes at the local level, which is really where continuums of care exist, that those protections aren't as well understood or known. And so the more that you understand VAWA protections and the more that you can be confident and sure of those, the more that you know when somebody says, I need you to give me this data, and you can say, absolutely not, and here's the federal regulation, you can always call me and I'm happy to give you that any day. Like those are your rights, and that's you protecting survivors. And so those are at odds with HUD regulation, but they're the things that protect our work, and they're the things that most importantly protect survivors. And these are the problems with victim service providers not being at the table when continuums of care were originally created. The COC's responsibility is to operate the continuum of care, move through the governance charter, set all of this up at the local level. There are a number of things that are required at the local level, and all of these items, including coordinated entry, which we'll talk more about in a different training, are required by the continuum of care. The data management is also required by the continuum of care, and that's called the Homeless Management Information System nationally. And that is something that, according to VAWA regulations, survivors' information cannot be entered into. Also, the continuum of care does the point in time count annually. And then their also responsibility includes other planning. And that includes things that you all need to be involved in every year. And that includes something called a consolidated plan. I'm happy to provide you more information on that, and coordination with other community planning for homelessness assistance. So annually, there has been what's called a NOFO, and we talked a little bit about that this is specifically for HUD, not for other federal funding. Last year, we were given a 2-year NOFO, which meant that all of our projects were going to be automatically renewed. And unfortunately, this administration has decided what we've heard is that they were not going to do that, but then the government shut down and we don't have a NOFO. And it has been a really challenging time to understand whether or not this funding is going to renew and how it is going to renew. There are a number of us that have been talking about this, and as soon as we have more information about what the 2025 renewal process will look like, my office will definitely let you all know, and the folks at JDI are very up on this. When we do have a normal funding cycle, we will definitely do education around letting you all know what that looks like and how it will operate. And the folks that submit that application are called the collaborative applicant. So that's just important for you to know. And then quickly, the different types of funding that are used are for housing, supportive services, and then additional system support. That includes permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. Permanent supportive housing is permanent, long-term rental assistance. Rapid rehousing is shorter-term rental assistance. All of this is community-based, but permanent supportive housing can look different in different models. And then the final one I wanted to mention is the joint component, and that is something that has brought transitional housing back to the table. It is a unique model that includes both transitional and rapid rehousing. So once we know more about the NOFO, I'm happy to walk you through those different models in a more specific way. But for now, what I would love to do is turn it over to Pat. And Pat, if you could spend a few minutes talking a little bit about your experience with engaging with the COC in your area, that would be fabulous.
I'm not sure
Bear
you
with
all
me just
want to
a
hear that.
second. I'm gonna find you, Pat. I'm gonna spotlight you. There you are.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank Maria, that was fabulous. And for those of us who've been doing it for a while, it's just an amazing amount of information that we can get. And I would also encourage all of you on this call, if you do have questions that don't get answered today, please, I've called Maria, I can't tell you how many times to say, can you help me with this? This is what my COC is saying. Is that accurate? And I apologize for going quickly, but I actually have to go to an emergency COC meeting for our continuum in about 4 minutes. We got involved with the COC probably 6 years ago now, and it was a struggle once the COC opened up, because you're going up against in your continuum, normally well-established homeless providers. We have 3 or 4 in our area. We have 3 or 4 very large nonprofit organizations who have been the lead, both locally and pretty much statewide, in providing services to the homeless population. Their way of dealing with survivors of domestic and sexual violence and trafficking was to just refer them, to the domestic violence program, expecting that we were going to be able to provide all the services that they need, plus find them housing if they were in their shelter. So we sort of inched our way in. We wrote our first NOFO. I think we got about $359,000 the first year. The second year we went up to, I think, 7. The next one we got about, I don't know, a little over $1 million. And then the last NOFO we wrote between our grant, our I forget what you call it. We got the DV bonus funds through the NOFO and our application, and it came in at almost $2.5 million. So we have, and it's funds. I think that the part that a lot of people don't understand is that it's funds that not only pay a portion of a survivor's rent while you're helping them figure out, financial stability, do financial planning with them. It can pay first, last security. It can pay up to 6 months of back rent. It pays moving costs. It can pay utilities until they get settled. So it's an enormous way to get a survivor either coming out of shelter or, who's in court and is homeless because she's been evicted, he or she's been evicted, getting them settled and then working with them over a year or 2 years, hopefully 2 years, to help them move on, and during that time to become stable and be able to, you can pay for them to we've paid for survivors to take a class to become a certified nursing assistant so that they become self-sufficient. So the rapid rehousing program, I think for us and for the population that we provide services to, has been a huge boon in assisting survivors towards housing stability. And the thing to remember is if they're survivors who are currently homeless or at risk for homeless, for example, in our COC catchment area, and it's not safe for them to continue living there, we can work with another COC on an emergency basis to move them into that COC, a different area. And I apologize that I have to run and I had to talk so quickly.
We appreciate you, Pat.
Thanks so much,
So
Pat.
much.
So
And
my Carlina, who's director of housing, is on this call. So if she can probably answer any questions about, our program if you need them.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stephanie, thanks for hanging in there.
Sure. You may jump in now. Is it good?
That'd be great.
Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Casa Mirna has had continuum of care funding for over 20 years. So it predates me at Casa Mirna. And when we originally had it, it was for transitional housing. And so about 10 or so years ago, HUD started to move away from transitional housing, which is interesting now that they may be going back. But what started going away from transitional housing, so we started shifting our funding to rapid rehousing, which was very new then. And at the time, rapid rehousing had only, I think, really been tested on individuals, and yet we had families. And so we shifted to our first contract was for 10 families. And so we had absolutely no idea what we were doing. Our COC had no idea what we were doing, especially around serving families. And there are days where we still don't know what we're doing, but we're sort of like make our way through it. So when we first shifted to rapid rehousing, nobody wanted it because it was, it wasn't actually, it didn't feel like it was housing like we had with our transitional housing program, that people had to get a lease. They had to find an apartment, they had to get a lease, and then we said that we could help them for a year or two with rental assistance. And so that was really, I think, scary for folks at the time. Now we have over 100 units or 100 families at a time that we can support. And we don't have enough resources for everybody who wants access to it. And I think that's in part, just sort of a reflection of the changing housing environment, that folks will take 2 years of rental assistance because there isn't anything better out. And so now we don't know what's going to happen sort of as it shifts. But so now we're starting to have those conversations with survivors. We also we don't talk about this very much because we're not very active in it, but another one of the maybe partnerships that you could potentially explore is if another organization has permanent supportive housing. We have 11 units. So Metro Housing has, I don't know, like hundreds of permanent supportive housing units. But so we have 11 of those are allocated to us. So we find the survivors who go into into that housing. It's basically they get a voucher for life as long as they're eligible, and we provide the services. But the housing provides the housing, the voucher, and so that has actually worked really well for us. We've been part of that for probably about 15 or 20 years as well, so that we don't have to manage the funding, we don't have to manage any of that part of it. We just identify the survivor, put them in there, and then provide support services to them. So that's also been a really good, I think, experience and relationship for us. So now, like I mentioned, we have about 100 families and individual survivors in rapid rehousing and in transitional housing to rapid rehousing programs. It also funds for us not only rental assistance for those folks and all the other things that Pat talked about, but we have about 8 staff that are funded by that. So we predominantly fund like our housing staff and economic stability. So it really is a great resource for staffing. And it covers probably 95% of folks' salaries and benefits. So there is no real ratio that at least HUD or the Boston Continuum looks at for how much you need for rental assistance versus staffing. And so we've definitely, we didn't have enough staffing to begin with. And so we've really, in our subsequent contracts, really increased the number of staff that we have. It can be, I think, as Maria and Pat said, it can be really hard to break into a continuum of care. But once you're in normal times, you're in. So like you have funding going forward. And with the DV bonus money, there has always been more money to apply for the last probably 7 years or so. Casa Mirna also, so the Boston Continuum of Care is run through the City of Boston Mayor's Office on Housing. So each continuum seems to be led by a different entity. Like in some, it might be a United Way, in some, it might be the municipality. It could be another homeless provider. And so that's something I think also to look at is who convenes your continuum of care. But so we have a leadership board on our continuum. And so Casa Mirna sits on it. We participate in working groups, as many as we can. It's a little bit taxing, I think, for staff time because there are the expectations that, at least in Boston, that folks sit on those. But it's really worth, I think, the connections and the access to the resources. And then we also provide training and technical assistance around domestic violence to the COC and to the partners. I would say some of the things that we've sort of really learned over time that's been really broad being engaged because, as Maria's been talking about, this stuff is really complicated and there's a lot of people who have funding in it and there's a lot of resources sort of moving around. And so being engaged is sometimes the only way to get your voice heard, to make sure that people are actually thinking about survivors. Oftentimes, a lot of COCs are focused on individual sort of chronic homelessness. So there's also the opportunity to bring up the issues that of families, because that's often missing, I think, from the conversation. Um, really learn the language, like what are folks talking about? Because again, it is like really complicated. And so like you can't be afraid to ask questions. I think some of the other things are that we've sort of played around with is like learning how to get around some of the guidelines. So, for example, and I think with as a domestic violence organization, and I think as a rape crisis center, other folks would have we have a little bit more flexibility. I think because I think as you know, like with even with our shelter systems, like most people are really afraid of DV sexual assault, and so they don't want to know too much about it. So like one of the things that we've certainly done to sort of work around it is like you have to be basically like from the continuum of care to access those resources. And so we sometimes put people who are not from our continuum in a hotel for a night, and then they're homeless in Boston, and then they're eligible. So there's things like that that like you can kind of like work around the edges and figure out how to do, as long as sort of like the language and the program requirements. Um, and I think the data protection is another one. I know for some COCs, there is a fight between the victim service provider and the COC around like, we're not giving you social security numbers. You can't count that against us. We're not giving you the names of people. But the fact that our data is protected and we don't have to put, or we can't put our data into the COC sort of inventory of people that they're serving, it gives us, I think, a lot more flexibility and a protection around the work that we're doing. um, I would say, like, sort of in preparation for the future. So we don't know what's going to happen. I don't even know if anybody's going to want to apply for COC funding over the next couple of years. We don't know what the program models are going to be and what the funding is going to look like. But I would say now is a good time to start getting to know your continuum of care. Like, figure out where the money is coming from. Go to leadership team meetings. Like, they should actually be open. Maybe not leadership team meetings, but sort of the continuum meetings should be open, and you can show up. And so know who's getting money, where it's going, what priorities the COC has, because the COC gets to set priorities. So make sure that domestic and sexual violence are one of those priorities that they're talking about. You can meet the folks in the COC to talk about referrals and partnership, even if you don't get funding directly from them. It really feels like now is the time, especially as things are changing, and there's so much uncertainty, to really get involved and make sure that the issue is there. And even if you don't get funding sort of in the first round, hopefully there'll be money going forward that you can access. But I think it's a lot of work, but it's also, I think, well worth it. Because like it is money that we use for really good supports for survivors, and without it we wouldn't have them. Like, there is no other place for it. And so I would definitely say it's worth your effort to sort of get involved and figure out how to access it. That's it.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I really appreciate it. And to just follow up on what Stephanie shared, this is a really interesting time to engage in continuums of care. There has been a concentrated effort by the Trump administration to move away from this model that we've discussed today. So it is an ironic time to be discussing it, but what we know is that the Hearth Act is still law, and it would take a literal act of Congress to overturn it. And the folks that I am in community with, and they're the same folks that Greta and Hema are in community with. I think that we're all hearing that like there isn't the congressional will to take those sorts of steps. I even heard as soon as yesterday that given some of the election results, that some of the more dire things that we had been hearing at the federal level about the Continuum of Care program potentially being eliminated have really been pulled back pretty significantly, which I was excited to share that federal level gossip with you all today. That's all I can tell you that it is just gossip. But I think that any sort of shred of hope we can all engage with is important. But what I can tell you is that the National Alliance to End Homelessness is doing truly incredible advocacy around um, making sure that everyone who's experiencing housing instability and homelessness continues to have access to these resources at the continuum of care level. They're an incredible organization. Their website is endhomelessness.org. Um, and actually, I think the meeting that Pat was going to, like someone from the National Alliance is speaking at that meeting. That's how on the local level they're interacting right now. And they have a deep understanding of what survivors need and how important it is to engage you all in this work and engage survivors in this work. So we're not an afterthought to the folks at the National Alliance, which always feels really great. So I want to encourage you that to both know that I'm feeling more hopeful today than I was even on Monday, which is great. And that like this is our fight. As much as I know you all are fighting like hell at the state level right now, and I please know I'm thinking about you all of the time. That fight needs to happen to the federal level also. These housing resources are essential and they're at deep risk, and I do think that the tides are turning. I think that federal resources still exist, that the Hearth Act is still law, VAWA is still law, all of the VAWA housing protections are still law, nothing has been overturned. And all of that information can be found at this link that I provided here for you. It's the HUD Exchange. And if you're like, gosh, this was so interesting, and I want to know everything I can about continuums of care forever, which I know you all do, HUD occasionally produces really, really cool resources. Sometimes they produce stuff and it's like, who wrote this? Other times they do awesome things. And a handful of years ago, they put together these virtual binders. And when they said they were doing this, I was like, cool, guys, that's a weird thing. Um,
Like binders of women. There's so many good binders. Do we remember
right.
binders of women?
Oh my God. Right. Right. Oh, it's a weird time, isn't it? So these are helpful binders. So if you have a question about um, eligibility, if you have a question about what a continuum of care program can fund, what it can't fund, what um, how much staffing can pay, what is actually allowed within staffing models, what's not. Um, One of my colleagues is a firm believer, and God knows, like I think in the gender-based violence movement, this is sort of how like we live our lives. Like know the rules so well that you know where they can bend. Read these binders. Like it's so helpful. And then you know exactly where you can say, that's all fine and good, but I'm going to put somebody in a hotel in Boston. Thank you very much. And also, if anybody has a fit about it, like I'm then going to explain to you survivor safety and why your rules are dumb. And here are all your rules. And here's how VAWA protections play out. And it all says this in these COC binders. And so, like, I just really want to encourage you to like know the information. Also know that like you can call me anytime. Like I really am happy to like talk with you through this and chat with you about what's going on in your community and think about how to be strategic about the resources and to answer like basic questions too. Because it is hard and complex, and like Stephanie said, like it takes over and over and over to retain this information. And there are still times that somebody will say something to me and I'm like, that's not right, right? And then I have to go look up the regulation to remind myself or to convince myself that I'm correct or to learn that I was wrong, because it's just like um dense and challenging. and important that you know where to go to look is really the best way that I can say it. So,
Can,
um,
can we
with that,
jump from there, Maria, into some questions?
mhm.
I think that's an awesome segue. Somebody asked, like, I think kind of to Stephanie's point and to the seed that you're planting now, Maria, um, like if our organization doesn't say necessarily want right now to break into this world, how do we connect with the organizations that are doing this in our area? So specifically the question was, is there a list for all of Massachusetts? What with the organizations that provide COC funding? My organization works with survivors across the state. It would be great to know how to refer survivors. This is a at once a simple question and a complicated one because of the way that folks can come into the COC systems, right? But I was hoping that you both could tackle this with some suggestions.
Well, go ahead, Steph.
No, so I was just saying, I think Maria probably has lots of good luck. I think, um, but so yeah, so it should be public knowledge who the convener is of each COC. So I think that map is a good place to start. And I know that we now have sort of lists of which sexual and domestic violence organizations are receiving COC. I think that's also a good place to start with like our sibling organizations, like what they know and who they're connected to. And then once you know, you can just call up, whoever it is and just be like, hey, I want to know more, or I really want to learn about it. And I think, I mean, I think they sort of, because COCs sort of come off as secretive because it's so jargon focused, because they're so different. But the folks who are doing the work are organizations like us. So I think like it is, you probably already know who they are in your community. You just don't, if you haven't like identified them yet, you probably have a relationship with them, because I know that sexual and domestic violence providers work so collaboratively with other organizations in our catchment areas or communities.
I'm dropping in the chat the map and the COC page with the Office for Housing and Livable Communities. And so that is a place to start to kind of see which COC covers which area. That big swath of, what color is it, yellow, is the balance of state. So that's kind of like whoever's left from all the other COCs. It's also taken in other COCs, like Somerville used to have its own, it doesn't anymore. It's part of the balance of state. So that's a place to start. And then, yes, we have Maria helped us put together, or Maria put together, kind of a list of within our membership who is getting COC funding. So that while that entity or that organization might not be the lead at the COC, they might be a great person, because we're all friends here, to talk to see about either referring a client directly or about getting more involved with that COC. Does that seem right to you both?
Absolutely. Like reaching out to JDI member programs is essential. Like you're going to get the most traction there, obviously. But if you're in a COC where there isn't a JDI member program that's funded, reaching out to your local United Way is often the entry point for what's called coordinated entry in your communities. And coordinated entry or coordinated access is sometimes what it's called, is the system through which everyone who is entering into the system must be screened in. And like I said, we'll talk about that more later, but if you can't find your way in, reaching out to United Way is what I always recommend. And if you don't want to do that and you can't figure it out, like email me and I will figure it out for you and get back to you, because your collaborative applicant is your main contact and all of that has to be listed with HUD, and I will dig around to find it for you.
Thank you.
I think a little bit one more note about sort of partnership around that and funding. Like if you don't want to sort of be an applicant, typically sort of COCs and HUD like partnerships. And so if there is a domestic or sexual violence program that wants to, like, you can work together on it too. So like one of Casa Mirna's contracts is a partnership with the hospital-based domestic and sexual violence programs, BARC and MAPS, because they don't have access to shelter. And so we do the housing part and then, pay for the housing and do the housing search kind of support. And then they provide the services to their participants. So there's definitely other ways, especially if more DV bonus money comes out. I think that's a great way for multiple organizations. If one person says, okay, we'll submit the application, that other folks can access the housing too.
I know that one program reached out the other day to say, we're looking for somebody with rapid rehousing, a rapid rehousing program in Quincy that we can refer them to. And I said, great. We referred them to Carlina and Pat at FCR. And so that is one way to kind of, that we can help connect you. But we can get that list out to everybody too. What else? Do other people have hot questions? I have a couple, but I don't see any others in the chat. But please unmute yourself or drop it in the chat or send us a passenger pigeon. Oh, just some love from Claire. We found the partnership between BARC and Casa Mirna so helpful for survivors. Yes. And I think that's the goal of the CO. Well, Maria, you're more optimistic, right? Kind of painting of the goal of the COC is to have this like warm referral and like surround, comprehensive. It really is a continuum of care. That's what it means, right? And so we have that within our network and that extends out into COCs. Well, maybe we'll just start. I have a question if no one else does. Stephanie, do you know or would you like to talk a little bit more about, since Casa Mirna has been involved with the Boston COC for a long time, kind of how new programs might come in? Want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, I think we've all sort of said that, for a long time, like the money was very finite and there wasn't more money coming into the COCs. And so then if you weren't part of it, you weren't going to get a new contract. Or even if you were in it, you weren't going to be able to expand it. But the DV bonus money has been like a godsend for us. And so in fact, like every year when the money does come out, like the city says, do you guys want to apply for this? And because I think a little note, because all the COC funding is cost reimbursement, we find that like we're spending I think like $150,000 a month on rental assistance that we have to front, and then sometimes it takes a while to get it. So we're sort of holding for the moment until we sort of like get our cash flow better. But so oftentimes like the city has come to us and said, do you want to apply for this new DV bonus money? And there have been times where we're like, no, we really don't want to. We can't. We don't have the cash to be able to put the money up front for rents right now. But if another organization wants to, like, we can help them figure it out. And so we've done that. There have been a couple of homeless service providers who wanted to do some domestic violence specific work. And so Jessica, our senior manager for that housing and economic stability, who probably everybody knows, spent some time with them to sort of say, okay, here's how we set it up. Here's what you might need to know. And then we just sort of continue to provide technical assistance to them because, we want it to work. So we want them to provide really good supports for survivors. And so the DV bonus money has definitely been a good way to get more providers and more funding specifically for services for survivors.
That's great.
Does that answer your question, Greta?
I think so. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it does. And it leads actually really nicely, because you kind of hinted at this, that you are, because of the cost reimbursement, which we all have, struggle and manage that with different programs. The question is, do you have a sense of whether programs that get COC funding in Boston and Cambridge actually have space or resources available to take on new clients? So it sounds like perhaps you are pausing, but say more.
I think for now, this is interesting because we've been having these conversations because So just sort of the kind of the ins and outs of like that HUD and the COC look at sort of your occupancy, like you're contracted for roughly X number of families. And the way the contract works is that you basically say, okay, I'm going to apply for 5 3-bedroom units, 2 1-bedroom units, and 3 4-bedroom units. And then basically whatever the cost is of the rent, basically that would be the maximum rent you can pay for those, becomes your budget for sort of the rental assistance. And then you can do staffing on top of that. So one of the things so it's constantly you're trying to sort of balance whether or not you have money to add new participants for rental assistance. But one of the things that we've been trying to do lately is, okay, we know that this funding may be ending, maybe changing, maybe slowing down. Like our current contracts, we have 1 year left on them because they start at the end of the year. So we know right now under the current program that we have 1 more year's worth of rental assistance. So we've really had to start to say to survivors now, we can't tell you it's going to be 2 years. It can only be 1 year. Do you still want to apply for this and give it a try? But so my point about sort of like sometimes the difficulty in sort of figuring out the budget is that there's always money typically sort of left over that we could provide. Maybe it's not 12 months of rental assistance, but if we could find somebody who needs first, last, security, and 3 months of rental assistance, like that's the kind of thing that we could definitely do. So I think that while I think we're in a place now, especially not knowing what's going to happen with the program, if we couldn't, offer somebody necessarily 12 months of rental assistance, but if anybody has somebody they want us to put in the hotel for a day, like help with, as long as they're otherwise eligible, pay rental assistance for like 3 months for them and security, like we could figure out how to do that. Because I think that also makes our numbers look good because HUD doesn't necessarily look at like how long people are in the program, but how many families or individuals are in the program. So I think like I would say also talk to your continuum of care. So if there's folks who need like time limited support, much shorter, I'm sure that we and probably the other COC providers could figure out how to like fit folks in.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. So Maria references at the beginning of the training too, which might not have clicked because you were just starting to learn about COCs, everybody. But so because of the shutdown, well, they were already delayed in releasing the new funding opportunity, which they call the NOFO through HUD for the COCs. So, but the shutdown has further paused that. And so programs, as Stephanie has shared, are just getting more conservative, more frugal about the spending because there's a possibility that they will have to cut off assistance that has already been kind of promised to survivors. So just getting where there might have been more it was more flush this time last year. There was just more of an idea that this program was continuing at the same rate. And so there's just a little bit more caution probably. But I know that the person who asked the question, their program is located in Cambridge. But so I can, just email me. I'll connect you with Transition House and Casa Mirna if you'd like, and can see about that short-term support. I love the creative thinking, and I think that's important. Like it is hard to do that within the regs because they are confusing, right? And so it's really helpful to have folks like you both, Pat, Carlina, Jessica, who really know those regs inside and out so that we really can be creative. So grateful to you. Anything else? Any other things that are burning that you want to get out, Stephanie or Maria?
Yeah, I mean, I would say to Maria's point about really knowing the regs so that you can get creative. It's absolutely, I think, beneficial to do that because I think, again, the flexibility around sort of domestic and sexual violence and most continuums sort of fear of asking too many questions. Which we can use for advantage, is so like I think Pat mentioned that for most homeless folks who are getting COC resources, they have to stay within the geographic boundaries of that COC. So in Boston and Cambridge, as you can imagine, like housing is like everywhere, super, super expensive. And so we are always saying, oh, it's not safe for them to be in Boston. We're like, financially, it's not safe for them to be in Boston. And so we can move people in other parts of the state.
Which is what everybody on this call is doing with all of your contracts, right? It's what you're doing with your DPH funded programs. It's what you're doing with your VOCA programs. It's just the creativity that you all already possess. So want to thank everybody on this call. Yeah, any other questions from those of you that are tuned in? Appreciate you coming for this session. Any other thoughts? We will share out this recording. We will share out the materials, and we will, per always, share out Maria's contact info. But you can also get in touch with me if you ever have questions that you want to be connected to Maria. But really big thank you to you both and to our interpretation team, and to all of you for bringing your questions, and for doing this amazing advocacy work with the survivors in your community. I'm really proud to work with all of you.
Thank you all so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Greta.
Thanks, Stephanie. Take good care. Travel safely.
Thank you.